that look good? Everybody see that? I guess you can hear me. 2 thumbs up, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so this is just a little slideshow about me trying to get to the next level with showing depth in the larger polymer work that I've been doing. So it actually started when I was at Pingree. So it was a few years ago, I think 3 years ago, that's right.
Yep.
And so it was that quest for the aspen trees, to get the aspen trees to look like the leaves, the feeling of the leaves. Because I started out just by doing some watercolors, which was sort of one of my words was about Pingree is reflection. So I did some watercolors just to kind of like open up my head. And I'm like, well, you know, I wanted to just go back to, I have a root in landscape painting. I always like to do that. So, but I started in this picture, I started doing the mountains and the sky, and then I got to the trees. I'm like, this is so complex. Like, how do you show something that has several different layers of complication? And that is like the essence of what makes it look really beautiful. You know, that there's all these different layers. So the clouds and the let's see if I got this right. Yeah, the clouds were my first attempt. And primarily I have been working like I have either a background or I'm working right on wax paper, and I'm taking pieces of veneer and laying them out like one piece at a time. So I'm sort of building a design. But the complexity of a cloud, you think about these puffy layers that are like seeming to come towards you. I felt like it's much too hard to fit those shapes around each other. So I started just, and these are really pretty sloppy, you know, I was like letting myself just really play at Pingree and not worry about the end result. And so I was cutting, I made the original shape, but then I started cutting pieces out and putting more pieces in. And then with the trees, I did the same thing. So I was looking at all the color variations and all the leaves, but also thinking about all the shadows that go back in on a tree. And that is really, you know, that I'm just starting to get like this. I would say I have like 2 levels of depth in it, but possibly 3 if you count like the dark mountains in the background. So here was my quest. I am in love with Queen Anne's lace, and it is such a, I've loved it since I was really little. So here is this incredibly complex flower, and I think we have, you know, this ability with polymer clay to do kind of fractally repetitive things. So I've been wanting to make
tools in the little hinged box, laptop and Kindle for entertainment.
I don't know what that was.
Polystamens are glass beads on ball head beads. The
Jan,
for each color in the first set of drawers.
I didn't have any video and I was messing around. I'll get off.
Okay, so. All
right, let's see.
You're muted, Bonnie.
All right, I'm going to unmute Bonnie.
Do you know sign language, Bonnie?
Okay, I think I
Laurel, I think she's still muted.
I know. I'm going to make Lori the host. This is
I got it now. I couldn't find my cursor in the screen slide. Okay.
I'm going to make Lori the host. This is beyond me.
Can you guys hear me though now? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So go back to this. All right. So Queen Anne's lace, you know, there's a bajillion little flowers, and I've had this idea about making really big flowers, basically taking weeds and things that are wildflowers that are not super special in a way, but making them really big to have us look at something very small and make it more important. So it's like, how do you show with the complexity of these things is what you love about them. So I was trying to figure out how to do this. So, and I really like the feeling, like when I was a kid, I used to hold them up like an umbrella, you know, and look up into them. And so I was thinking about, how do I show this thing that goes back and then all these different petals? So, and I know that I'm not going to get every single petal, but how do I even indicate this kind of complexity? So I started with photographs that I had, and I then did a sketch and blew it up. So this is, I put it, the only thing I've learned how to do on Adobe Illustrator really well is like blow up a drawing. So that's about as far as I've gotten with Adobe Illustrator. But I did blow this up, print it out on different, numerous pieces of paper. But here's what I was getting at, you know, so this is one floweret. So what I'm going to show you is how I'm doing one floweret and how that then expanded into something bigger, and how each one of these had multiple layers of so it looks like you're looking back in. In my mind, there's almost 5 layers of depth here. So, and so you can see, I really, since I started working in jewelry, I started really thinking about components more than building one thing, but working in smaller units. And honestly, it's a lot easier for my back and for working on a large scale, that it's hard to be working on something really big all the time. And it's also how I sort of comprehend it now, is like break it down, zone in on one thing, and then put it all back together. So this is kind of how the thing was going to emerge. And each floweret is sitting on a piece of wax paper. So this is the basic idea. The first thing is that I have this blue background, and that in of itself is actually 2 layers. And the one layer is this sort of sky blue. And then the layer on top of that is actually translucent with some sort of wispy white mixed in. And I was actually, so I started out with just like a blue oval. And then I got my handy dandy little petal cutter, not very exciting, but I'm like, okay, I'm going to sort of turn this into a pattern, and I'm just going to keep using this petal cutter. And what I did is I made a Skinner blend that went from pretty pure white and then to pearl, and then to a very light gray. So I was trying to show some shadowing in each little flower. So what I did is I started out with the sky, and then it's subtractive in that I took my petal cutter and cut out these areas, and I used a gouge, one of my carving or little linoleum cutter gouge, to indicate where the branches were going to come up. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 flowers started, but I know that I want some petals to look like they're coming further on top of that. So first I start with the base layer, and there's my gouge. And then I also was using a Skinner blend even on the little stems, because I want that feeling of shadow. So it's like painting, but trying to paint with the clay. So then I was laying in little strips to be like the stems. And so that's what it looks like. And by the way, this is so sloppy. You know, this is I work on a big glass table, and that's, you can see those are inch square blocks. So, you know, when I'm doing jewelry, it's so fussy, but on a large scale, like this stuff looks pretty sloppy. Here it is after I put wax paper over it and burnished it. And obviously it cleans a lot up, but when this is on a really big piece, a lot of that detail has kind of a painterly feeling about it, but it doesn't really show. So here's sort of, now I have 3, essentially the feeling of 3 layers, because the sky has like a deep background layer. It'll have sort of a floaty layer over it. And then the 3rd layer is all these stems and petals. And then what I did with each one of them was cut out more petals, still thinking about shadow, and added them on top, and then added the little center. This is getting more and more gestural. It's less and less exactly like a Queen Anne's lace. So that is the basic idea. So here you can see how I was laying them all out. Now I've done 2 sets of these big Queen Anne's laces, and I actually learned something in the process about fussing with this 2nd layer of detail. This is kind of what it looks like before it's fired, and I have added more stems in there as well, like a layer. And you can see how splotchy the background looks like, but it's really interesting. I actually used where I had each blue oval and cut out the little petals. I saved all those little pieces of blue and I used them to fill in all the spaces in between the flowers. And you'd think it would look really blotchy, but it actually has a really interesting sort of, reminds me of woodcuts or sort of painterly effect. Here you can see I've been laying on that second layer of flowers. So it starts to make like, it feels, and then some stems are on the top layer too, going over some of the flowers. So now you start to feel like things are dropping back. So that is, I think that is pretty much it before I fired it. That's what it looked like once it was fired. And you can see how it has sort of a pebbly surface and it starts to give this feeling of like, there's something back there. It's sort of sky-like, but it's not super defined. Like an unfocused, like a photo where you're focused on the front, but the back is sort of more undefined. And then this is the second time round I did this. What I ended up doing is firing the whole first layer and not adding the top layer on, because one of the problems with this is that once I put that sort of raised layer on there, I couldn't really burnish it and smooth it out or, you know, get the lint off of it very easily because there's all these little sections of raised petals. So I realized I could fire this whole first section and then come back and fire the next layer on it. And it was much easier to work with. The other thing to know about what I'm doing now is I used to put 2 layers, like a scrap layer underneath, and that actually is really hard to do subtractive with because I'm always trying not to pick up the under layer. So I only work 1 layer thick now. It's like a 32nd of an inch. It's like a number 5 on my pasta machine. If it goes, 1 is the thickest and 6 is the thinnest. So I'm working very thin. And when this stuff comes out of the oven, I could basically cut it with scissors. It's so thin, but it really is easier to work with. So here you can see that this flower, it's fired. And then now I'm laying on those petals and the little like stamen type things. And it was so much easier to work with. I could take this petal, this flower, and like move it around, and I could actually cut down on the surface and not mar it. So that was a real revelation for me. So that's what the 2 flowers look like. And I love the way all the sky, you can see the way the sky kind of clears out in between the stems and just has this sort of almost watercolor effect that basically I can't plan it because I cannot see that translucent layer over the blue. I can't really see where the white is until it's fired. So it's really kind of fun to watch the reveal of that. And these I'm making in components too, so that there's a stem, and there's a leaf, and there's another seed head. So I was working in manageable parts. So the seed head was even harder than the flower. I thought the flower was hard. I'm like, how on earth do you show this kind of depth and complexity? So I started out with the same idea, except that I actually made the full circle of the background and sky. And then I started carving and laying in all the green lines. And then, see if I can go back to that. All these little seed pods, I was trying to figure out how to indicate those. So I've just been using a circle cutter to kind of give that feeling of all these little seeds in there. And then this was the first one I did. So this was the first try. And so I went ahead and added that next layer on top of it, but I also was using darker clay. So it looks like it's closer to you, or it's different growth in the plant. So that's kind of, there you're seeing the different layers on that. So this was the first set of flowers I did. So this was the seed head. And, I love it. I'm just like, how many more little dots can I add to just keep giving this feeling of really full complexity and lots of little seeds and texture? Because it kind of becomes more textural. The other really different thing I'm doing with these flowers is we actually are cutting the edges or are organic. It's glued down to a 1/4 inch piece of plywood. So bless my husband's heart, he is actually cutting these out in a lot of detail once it's been glued down to the wood. So I'm going for an organic edge. Now here you can use, I'm using feathery bronze here. And it looks really, here you can see it bling. And there it is once it's fired. So second time I did this, I got this far, didn't add the top texture. And oh, this is a quick little thing that shows you how I flip a big piece. So this big piece, this piece is like, I'm gonna say it's like 20 inches square. So I have it on wax paper that's, and some of you may have seen this before, but I've been trying to photograph more of my work in process. So I cut the wax paper, which is kind of stretched on my glass tabletop. I cut it and then I slip a piece of backer board underneath it. And I put another piece of wax paper on top and I burnish it a little bit, put another piece of backer board on top and flip it and then peel the wax paper off the back. So it's kind of fun to see what the back looks like. And then I put cornstarch on it, sort of spread it around. Now I'm putting the glass on top of it where I'm going to fire it and I flip it again. So now I'm face up again. That's like flipping a cake. But it's such a thin piece. I just have to use the wax paper to keep it stable and not to distort. So there I am peeling off the wax paper. So now it's ready to fire. So that's how I move big things around. And then, so then after that fired, you can see how all that blue is really kind of chewy, chunky background look, which gives a real feeling of depth, I feel. And then I added the that top layer, and it was so much easier to work with after the bottom layer was fired. And then this is just kind of for fun. You can see I'm still using the cutouts from the petals to fill in around this little bud. And then the stem. And then this is what it looks like once it's fired. And then these are, let's see if this is, so these are about a 32nd of an inch, and they are just stuck to my wall with push pins. And we were trying to figure out the orientation. So each flower head and each stem is a separate piece. And actually these are mounted to the wall as separate pieces too. And here you can see when it's finished, you can see it actually, we decided to make these lift off the wall, which gives it a sculptural feel that we've never had with work before. And here's the finished piece. And I think that's it. Oh, nope, here's another close-up look. Yeah, there you really get to see how thick it is. And after we glue it to the wood, I painted the edge, but there you really see the dimension. So that is sort of the finished effect. So, okay, now stop sharing. All right, cool. So why don't we just, if people want to ask questions, let's unmute and go for it.
What kind of glue do you use to glue it to the board?
It's called Rue glue, and it's just meant for gluing plastic to wood. And then we have a big veneer press that you'd use for furniture, and it's a vacuum press. And yeah, we totally downsized our shop. We have one bay of a 2-car garage now, and actually only about 2/3 of that now. So we have to work a little smaller for sure. But yeah, we still, you basically have to clamp it down somehow. So a veneer press, a vacuum veneer press is like a giant Ziploc bag that you suck the air out and it just sucks the whole thing down. And so Mark will cut it out so it is almost the size of the flower, and then he goes back and cuts the whole edge with the bandsaw mostly, and then files it. And then the last thing we do is paint it. But it's so different than the furniture for us, because the furniture I was always trying to make flat surfaces, and this is just so different now. And then it's like, oh, I can have texture. Oh, what am I going to do with the texture? Okay, now how am I going to make a really complex, add even more depth, because I have this whole other, to me, adding those next layers of depth and adding and then subtracting and then adding back in felt really different to me, as just like how you get this just like delicious layers of kind of like, wow, there's so much in that flower. That's what the I want to get to love about those flowers. So.
So are the pieces intended to hover away from the wood? Is that how it's going to be, or they're sinking into the wood? He's cutting out yeah.
Oh, they're glued to the wood, but
Yeah.
then that finished piece, it's almost like a piece of scenery. The whole piece floats above the wall. It's just because we have blocks, the way we hang it, it sits about 2 inches out from the wall. So it creates this sense of depth as well. So in fact, that is almost like another way of creating depth, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Bonnie, is the black-eyed Susan that's behind you, is that done that way as well?
It is, yeah. Yeah, there's the drawing and there's the flower, and it has a leaf, and this is made to look, it's made to be mounted in a corner so that it looks like it's peeking out, or by a door frame, so it looks like it's peeking out. So what it's alluding to is that there is some gigantic garden just beyond what you're able to see. And I love the feeling of extending people's thought beyond the thing they're looking at. So let's make our homes into giant gardens, right?
Well, that's what I wanted to say. What you're not getting from the slideshow is the size of these things, because I saw them at a show 2 years ago. Bonnie, is that sound right?
Yeah.
And
they're about 7 foot tall. Yeah.
They're giant, and when you're in them, you just feel like you're Alice in Wonderland shrunk down. They're fabulous.
Which is part of the feeling when I was a kid, a Queen Anne's lace just looked so big. It was so cool to like hold it like an umbrella, and it was just like a magical object when I was a kid. So that's what I was thinking.
Do you use balsa wood for the back?
No, it's plywood. It's 1/4-inch plywood. We've been getting pre-finished 1/4-inch plywood because we don't have a finishing room anymore, which kind of changes the way we deal with things. So, and that helps because when you glue something to a wooden surface, you're essentially sealing one side of it. So if you don't seal the other side, it'll absorb moisture and expand. So what we have to do is kind of have 2 sealed sides, and then we still attach a frame to it that keeps it more stable. Yeah.
Bonnie, this is Maureen. I'm reading some of the questions from the chat, and Christine is asking, do you sand at all?
We don't sand as much, for sure. We try to just go over it with 2000 grit. And, because there's a raised surface, if there's any rough edges, I kind of like to take them down. But one of the things I do a lot now is prior to firing anything, I use rubbing alcohol on a Q-tip to just smooth out any edges and pick up all the lint that comes from outer space. And boy, I almost lost my mind with the black-eyed Susan because there isn't anything like yellow to just, it's like, where you fire it and then what is that green thread there, But again, you're looking at these from really from a considerable distance. So if you could look up close, you'd be surprised how rugged it is. But we're really moving into the feeling of painting. So I actually really like, even if you see little seams in between the colors, to me, that feels more painterly. And, I'm kind of defining what we're doing. So yeah, we don't polish as much at all. Yeah.
Several people, Laura and Maggie, are both asking about your oven. Can you talk about the size of your oven and how big of a piece you can put into your oven?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it's funny. I was part of that working large group, and I have some pictures of the studio that show all that. But I just have a standard oven. It was an old Farberware that someone got rid of and didn't want. They're having their kitchen remodeled. I got it for free, and the only dealio is you have to wire it like a regular oven. But I couldn't do any of this without that.
Sure.
So workhorse. It has very consistent temperature, and it's vented, and yeah.
Great. And then how about those large pieces? How do you handle any bubbling that might happen in the baking process or the curing process?
Well, it does help to have the cornstarch because it doesn't sort of like stick in one place and capture air on the glass surface. So once I have it on the glass surface, I still have wax paper on the top. I can smooth it out. And then I still get bubbles, like a bigger bubble, not like little tiny bubbles, because now I'm not sticking that veneer down to another surface. That's a big group. I make it a larger bubble, like say maybe like a sub one bubble. But what I do is when it's done firing, I put it on a flatten and put another piece over top of it. That helps flatten it out. And then at the end of the day, it's so thin that when we put it in the veneer press, it'll suck that right down. It really isn't a problem. It's crazy. I could wrap that design around a pencil. It is so thin. It's kind of silly how easy it is to handle. I use so little clay too. I mean, after making credenzas, I'm like, man, I actually didn't use that much clay to make a flower. You know, so it's interesting that way. Yeah.
Bonnie, this is Julie. I know you said you added pearl. Do you use translucent in there to get some more depth in there in your clay?
Yeah, only on the sky where I have that translucent layer. It is kind of tricky because you will see the subsurface if you have a lot of, you know, so it's like, oh, we might have to paint it. We actually, another piece that we did, I had some translucent and we ended up basically priming the board.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, whoops, you know.
It was fascinating watching your head spin and trying to solve problems, because I'm always coming up with these wild ideas in depth and 3D and large, and I come up with some crazy things. I never quite get anything accomplished, but my brain does that. So it was fun watching it.
It's hard. It's huge problem solving. You know, drawing and painting is very abstract. We're trying to convince people what they're looking at, even though it's flat, is three-dimensional. And I heard some neurologists say, you realize that what you're doing is extremely abstract, even if you're drawing something realistic. You know, and honestly, when I heard that, it made me cry, because I was just like, yeah, I am working so hard to, you know, if you try to do figure drawing and someone has like a hand coming at you, you're like, oh, that is the weirdest shape ever. That is not, I know what a hand looks like, but that is not what that looks like.
Yeah.
You know? So it's the same kind of problem. And it's, oh, gee, we added color. Oh, holy shit. You know, like color is so hard to figure out. It's like, what is the color telling me? You know, so it's huge. It's huge. It's really so much more like painting. But then the whole point of me sharing this with you is like the technical thing is like, am I adding? Am I subtracting? How do I get this detail, you know, with my mind? Yeah.
Very cool.
Very cool. Very cool.
Beautiful.
How many of you have done something at all similar in any way to what Bonnie is talking about? Alice has, Ed has.
Not me.
Cindy has. It's very, very interesting. Libby, Joan, Carol.
Small.
No, it's funny. I mean, 8.5 by 11. It uses very little clay. If you just did something the size of a sheet of paper, it's so painterly. I mean, Skinner blends are just delicious.
I think that's your perspective, though, from furniture to that. Because once you go from jewelry to 8.5 by 11, feels like you're using a lot of clay.
But you aren't. You really aren't, right? When you say that, because you just made the switch, right?
I still think, to me, it feels like I'm going through a lot of clay. But
yeah. I do. I mean, I have, but these flowers, actually, it's not that much. If it was a 7-foot tall painting or wall piece, yeah, it would be. But the actual flowers, not like, you know, it's like this, but yeah.
I have a question. This is Maureen. I have a question for Judith Skinner. Can Judith unmute her mic? Or maybe the hostess needs to do that, the host. There she is. Judith, I know we've asked you this before, but how does it feel when people just throw around your last name as if it's a normal thing?
It feels great.
Yeah, you catch that. That got used quite a few times in this demonstration lecture.
Oh, Judith, I owe you so much.
Yeah, all of us.
25 years ago. That was 25 years ago.
Well, it's still an incredible concept. I'm still wrapping my head around it.
I use it a lot.
I use it all the time.
How many people don't use it?
Crazy talk.
It's crazy talk.
Even my husband knows your name.
Well, any more questions for Judith or for Judith or Bonnie?
I had a quick question.
Just a minute, who is this?
This is Libby.
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 What type of mechanism are you using to hang these pieces then?
Oh yeah, I have a little bit more in the other thing we're doing.
Okay.
Right now we've been using, basically it's called a French cleat, and it's so it's like if you have a flat piece, it's like a little ledge that comes off of it, and it goes across it like a ledge. It's just it's at an angle, and then you put another cleat on the wall so they fit together like this. And what's nice about that, like with these flowers too, it was almost like you have to make an arrangement. Like you start with the stem or the flower head to mount it, and then it actually allows us to move things a little side to side, but it only takes like 4 screws. And you screw this bar, you know, one side of the cleat on the wall, and then you put the other side on. And that actually the first set of flowers we made, a woman bought it for her daughter in Chicago. Obviously it was really special, but we shipped it to them and with directions, and they mounted it. But we couldn't do something like that with a big like furniture wall hung cabinet in the same way. It's like what we did, which is an interesting question because there were multiple pieces. They come with basically a pattern piece for each flower, a template that you stick up on the wall. It's just paper with holes where you put the screws. And it took us a while to figure this out. Did our best IKEA, like, here, stick this template, make a flower arrangement with all the templates, screw where the holes are, and hope to God it all goes together. And when we've had to hang it at shows, and we're like, okay, nobody talk to us, and then we're like, let's fight each other's heads off, and let's see if we get the pieces to fit together. And we're like, oh no, we're going off the side of the booth, and have to go at it again. But it does make it much more transportable because it's in pieces and it has these cleats. It's pretty tight. Yeah.
The template idea, your customers must love you for that, though.
Yeah.
We'll see. We've only sold one big set of flowers. But yeah, it really is very new for us. But the Queen Anne's lace was just such a huge challenge. The Black-Eyed Susan was much more one-dimensional, but So.
So the 7 feet tall ones, are those just one piece or there are more than?
No, the flower head is one piece, the stem is another piece, and the leaf or bud is a third piece. Yeah, and even, no, the stems are one piece, but I think we have tried to figure out how to make the stems 2-piece. Actually, when I make the veneer, I have a really long table here. So it's like a 7-foot table, and I make the whole thing, and then I decide where we have to cut it to fit in the oven. So then I cut it up, and then we fire it, and then we reassemble it on the wood. So, it's like, put it together, take it apart, but visually I have to see it as a whole piece. Although I don't really like working sideways, that kind of weirds me out. But and it's also like, it's so big that as I'm looking at it, I'm not really getting the perfect overhead look. So, at the end of the day, I'm kind of like, God, I hope this all looks all right when it's flat on the wall. But that's why I start with, I love just doing these drawings and blowing them up on Adobe Illustrator. Because it's, I'd like to always do the sketch first. So that is really my hand in the interpretation, but it's worked fine. So I don't know.
Oh,
someday my studio is going to look like where the wild things are, like when his room turns to a forest.
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie. That was wonderful.
That was great.
Wonderful.
Those of you that want to listen to the next part about working large, that is on Thursday morning, Birds of a Feather at 10:30. You'll see that on your schedule.